The tiller ship broke through the dawn haze over Calder Flats, with its hull doors already blooming open, and the first broadcast we intercepted called Earth Fallow. Estate fallow, it said, in a language half a me years dead. Stock feral. Title clean. That was the veil doing its work, and I had spent 41 years in Warden Tower 9 waiting to watch somebody believe it. The ship was wider than the dry lake it chose to land on. I watched it through the tower glass with my coffee going cold in my hand, and the old gunner's arithmetic ran in my head without being asked. 9 kilometers of hull, gravity ballast on her belly like barnacles. No weapons run out. She wasn't rigged for a fight. She was rigged for a harvest. There were soil augers folded along her keel the size of grain elevators, and her bow carried a crest burned into the plating, a spiral of 7 furrows. I knew that crest. Every child on Earth knew that crest. We had been digging it out of the deep strata under this desert for 9,000 years. My name is Marek Voss. I was 84 years old that morning, range warden first class, last posting of a long service, and the Sarothi Combine had come back to Earth, exactly where we always knew they would. They landed on the bones of their own estate house. They could not have done anything else. We had kept this ground looking empty for them, the way you keep a porch light burning. The tower systems logged the landing shock at 6 minutes past dawn. By 8 minutes past, the flats were crawling. Hold ramps came down on hydraulics that had not been serviced in geological time, and the reap wardens walked out onto Earth in columns of 40, armored in gray-gold carapace plate, 4 arms each. The lower pair carrying scythe rifles at rest and the upper pair held wide in the posture, the doctrine called open-handed claim. Behind them came the assay engines, low machines like brass beetles, tasting the soil. I counted 600 soldiers before I stopped counting and called it in. Vigil Actual, Tower 9, I said. They're out and walking. Assay engines deploying north and east. No weapons charged. They're acting like they own the place. They think they do, Warden. Vigil Marshal Tio's voice came down the line from the Meridian Ring, flat and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this morning her entire career, as had her mother, as had 400 generations of mothers before that. Hold your post. Let them taste the dirt. So I held and they tasted. The assay engines drank soil and sampled air and pinged the water table, and the tiller ship's masts threw their findings at the sky in the old Combine register, and everything they found told them what the Veil wanted them to know. A wild planet. Feral herds on managed grass they read as wilderness. A breathable sky scrubbed of industry. No cities where their instruments looked, no fleets where their instruments listened, no power signatures anywhere their doctrine said power signatures mattered. 500,000 years of fallow, just as the rotation promised, and the estate ready for the plow again. And then their claim went up, and that part I will remember the exact shape of until they bury me. The tiller ship's main mast spoke at full power, wideband, addressed not to anyone but to the planet itself, the way a man reads a writ to an empty courtroom. Estate 993. Title held by the Sarothi Combine under the Tillage Codex, furrow and seed, root and yield. Resumption of tillage is declared. Let the ground stand ready. I looked at the words scrolling on my console and felt something in my chest I had no easy name for. It was not fear. It was closer to the feeling you get watching a man step confidently onto ice you know is rotten. Vigil Command let the claim hang in the air for 1 full minute. I learned later that the delay was deliberate, argued over for decades in the protocol halls, a minute being long enough to seem like silence and short enough to seem like an answer. Then Earth replied. Not from the ring, not from the fleet, not from any voice the Sarothi could see. The reply went out from my tower, from the transmitter 2 floors under my boots. In old Sarothi, so clean their own mast logged it as a Combine source before it caught itself. Title contested. The estate is occupied. Stand where you are and be assayed in turn. 11 words in their dead language, and I watched 600 reap wardens stop moving at the same instant, the way a field of wheat goes still when the wind quits. The assay engines froze mid-taste. The tiller ship's mast swiveled, hunting, and found nothing, because the Veil bent their hunting around my tower like water around a stone. For 9 full seconds, the oldest empire in the spur stood on our desert in total silence. Then every instrument they had turned inward and began recalibrating, because the first rule of an arrogant instrument is that it would rather doubt itself than its doctrine. I watched their masts run the same sweep 11 times. I watched a reap warden officer strike an assay engine with his lower fist as if the machine had embarrassed him. The flats filled with their voices, a low chorus of clicks and tearing cloth syllables, and our intercept translators ran it for me in a calm subtitle crawl. Malfunction, echo. Ghost signal, fault in the mast, fault in the veil of the sky, fault anywhere but in the title. Tower 9, Vigil Actual. Tio again. Stand by to be noticed. We're going to let them find you. Understood, I said, and put my coffee down, and turned off the kettle out of an old habit of leaving things tidy when company was coming. The veil thinned over my grid square at 12 minutes past dawn, a deliberate parting no wider than a courtesy. To the Sarothi, it would have looked like their instruments suddenly remembering how to see, and what they saw was Warden Tower 9 standing alone on the rim of the dry lake. 110 meters of weathered gray ceramic with a light at the top, the kind of structure you could mistake for a relic if you wanted to. They wanted to. The first assay report their officers filed on my home called it a remnant beacon, automated dormant. Then the tower's gallery lights came on, all of them, because I turned them on and the report changed. A column of reap wardens peeled off the landing line and came across the lake bed toward me at a parade walk. 40 soldiers, 2 assay engines, and at their head an officer in taller armor the color of old brass, his upper arms bare of weapons and his helmet carried in his lower hands. The intercept crawl named his rank for me before he had covered half the distance. First cultivator, the master of the tiller ship, the holder of the writ, the man who had crossed 500,000 millennia of cold sleep to plow my world. I rode the lift down with my hat on. There are not many advantages to being 84, but one of them is this. Nothing on the far side of a door can be stranger than the things you have already outlived. The protocol said I went out alone, on foot, unarmed, and the protocol had been written when my grandmother's grandmother was young, and I had recited it so many times in drills that my boots followed it without consulting me. One old man walks out to meet the landing. Not a soldier in armor, not a diplomat in colors, not a wall of guns, one old man in a range coat, because the first thing Earth wanted the Combine to see up close was how little we were worried. The morning was cold and smelled of creosote and dust. I walked out through the boundary gate and across 400 meters of open hardpan with the sun coming up red on my right shoulder, and the reap warden column halted at the old surveyed line where the estate house threshold had stood, which they could not have known was surveyed. And I stopped 2 meters from the first cultivator of the Sarothi Combine and looked up into a face built like a cathedral door. He was 3 meters of him, gray gold plate over muscle that moved wrong for Earth, double-pupiled eyes set wide, breathing slits along the jaw flexing slow. The crest of 7 furrows was inlaid in his chest plate in something that wasn't gold. His soldiers fanned out behind him in a half-moon, scythe rifles still at rest, and the 2 assay engines crept forward and tasted the ground I stood on, and one of them tasted me, a thread of light running boot to hat brim. The first cultivator spoke first, and his voice was a rock slide taught grammar. The crawl on the inside of my collar fed me the translation half a beat behind the sound. Feral stock does not contest title, he said. Feral stock does not speak the furrow tongue. Explain the malfunction. No malfunction, I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. The estate is occupied. Has been the whole time. You're standing on the front porch, cultivator, and you've been announced. The owner of the house is deciding how much of it to show you. The assay engine at my feet chimed and spat its findings up some channel I couldn't hear, but I watched them land on the cultivator's face. I knew what the machine had found, because we had decided long ago to let their machines find it. Marker genes in my blood 500,000 years old, the Combine's own husbandry brands, the property tattoos written into the stock they bred for this estate and abandoned in the ice. Proof, in their own ink, of what I was. And alongside it, things their catalog had no entry for, a lattice of engineered immunities, bones reinforced against accelerations no animal needs to survive, an implant web running my optic nerve, 84 years old, and the cell chemistry of a man of 40. The first cultivator's breathing slits went still. His lower hand set his helmet down on the hardpan, slow, the way you put down a thing you might need both hands free of. You carry the brand of the tillage, he said. We carry a lot of things, I said. You'd be amazed what the stock picked up while you were gone. He looked at me for a long time. Behind him, 40 reap wardens stood in their half-moon with the rising sun catching their plate, and not one of them moved, but I could read the stillness changing quality, the way you can tell the difference between a quiet room and a held breath. State your office, the cultivator said at last. Range Warden First Class Merrick Voss. This ground is the Calder Flats designated range, and I keep it. I let that sit a moment. You'll want a bigger word than warden, so here's the rest. I speak first because we decided, a long time before you woke up, that the first voice you heard on Earth would belong to somebody old. We wanted you talking to a man who has personally watched 70 of your absent years go by, so that when he tells you how long we have been ready, you can do the arithmetic on his face. Ready. He took the word and turned it over like a stone with something under it. Ready for what, brand bearer? For you. For this morning. I nodded past him at the tiller ship squatting on the dry lake. You filed a return window with your own machines before you left. The plow keeps a calendar. We dug up the plow. I watched it land. The breathing slits along his jaw rippled once, and the officer at his left shoulder, slider in assay cast plate with lenses instead of a visor, leaned forward a degree, and the crawl tagged the movement as an assayer requesting leave to speak and not receiving it. The fallowing engines are sealed under the ice of the rotation, the cultivator said. They are sealed under doctrine. The ice left, I said. Delac didn't hold the door. Your engines have been out of the ground for 9,000 years, cultivator. We pulled the first one out from under this desert when we were still riding animals to do it, and we spent 40 centuries learning to read what was written on its gears, and the last thing we decoded was the schedule, the long rotation. 500,000 years, give or take a decade of orbital drift. I held his eyes. They don't blink, Cerothi eyes. They shudder. Top and bottom plates closing like a door. His shuddered once. You're 11 years late. We were starting to worry you weren't coming. The assayer behind him spoke then, leave or no leave, 3 quick phrases the crawl gave me as, the numbers conform, the window conforms. First, cultivator, the stock has read the almanac. Silence, Veth, the cultivator said, without heat, the way you'd silence a clock. He turned to slow quarter circle, taking in the flats, the brown line of the Carrion Hills to the north, my tower with its lights burning, the herds out on the eastern grass that his instruments had filed under Farrell. I watched him look at it all again with the word ready sitting in his craw, and I gave him the time. T.O.'s voice ticked once in my collar, the channel from the ring. He's rerunning the assay. Let him. The second assay took an hour, and they did not ask my permission, and I did not pretend my permission mattered yet. The brass beetles ranged out in widening spirals, and this time they were told what to doubt. They found the herds first, and the herds undid them a little, because every animal on that grass carried a range tag 2 centuries more advanced than anything on the tiller ship, and the grass itself ran in soil that had been mineral balanced by machines that came and went at night. They found the water table next, and the water table was managed, every aquifer metered, every spring on a maintenance schedule, the whole desert-attended thing wearing wildness like a work coat. One by one, their findings stacked up into a sentence no instrument wanted to say. First, the wilderness is artificial. The fallow is a costume. I stood on the hardpan and watched 600 soldiers come to understand, in the space of one morning, that the planet had dressed itself for them. Why? The cultivator said finally. It wasn't a question shape in his language. The crawl flagged it as a demand for accounting, the form a foreman uses on a ledger that won't balance. If the stock holds power, the stock displays power. That is the law of every field. The strong stand tall to be seen, you hid. Why does a strong thing hide? And there it was, the question the whole morning had been built to make him ask. The question Vigil Command had spent lifetimes maneuvering some future Cerothi officer into asking aloud on the record, on our ground. Because we weren't hiding from you, I said. We were waiting for you. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole answer, and you're going to spend the rest of the day learning it. A thing that hides is afraid. A thing that waits has plans for you. I turned and pointed my chin at the sky over the Carrion Hills, washed blue and empty clear to the stratosphere. You assayed that sky on the way down. Tell me what you found. Nothing, he said. Weather birds, Marshal, I said to my caller. Show him the ring. The veil came off the sky the way a sheet comes off a monument. There was no flicker, no shimmer, none of the theater a lesser engineering would have needed. There was simply the moment before, when the morning sky over Calder Flats was blue and bottomless and bare, and the moment after, when the meridian ring stood across it from horizon to horizon like the rim of a wheel the size of the world, 1,100 kilometers up, 4 kilometers thick, gun-gray and sun-catching along 10,000 kilometers of visible arc, with the morning light running down its flank in a single unbroken blade. It had been there the whole time. It had been there, in one growing form or another, for 6,000 years, and the Cerothi had flown under it on their descent like a fly under a lintel, and their instruments had been politely and comprehensively lied to. The sound 600 reap wardens make when their sky changes is one I expect to keep. It was not a gasp. It was a rattle, plate against plate, an army flinching in armor, and then absolute stillness. And the only thing moving on the whole of the Calder Flats was the morning wind picking at the dust their landing had thrown. The first cultivator stared up at the ring for 11 seconds. Both sets of pupils had gone wide, and his lower hands had risen halfway to where his weapon would have hung if he had worn one to a parley. Orbital agriculture, he said at last, and the crawl flagged the tone as the Cerothi register for a man rounding a thing down to save his own footing. A granary band. Stock builds granaries. Marshal, I said, he thinks it's a granary. Then we'll open a window, Tio said, on the wide channel this time, in Old Cerothi, so that every helmet on the flats heard her in their own dead tongue. First cultivator Surath Kaven, master of the tillership Vanj Karai, holder of writ under the tillage codex. This is Vigil Marshal Tio, and the ring you are looking at is the smallest thing I command. Earth grants you assay rights for 1 day under escort because we have waited a very long time for the chance to show somebody. Look at everything, count everything, write it all down. And when your account is taken, cultivator, you will be asked one question once. Take the day to think about your answer. What question? The cultivator said to me, not the sky. I looked up at 3 meters of returning landlord, standing on the buried doorstep of his own estate house with the ring coming up over his shoulder like a second dawn, and I gave him the words exactly as the protocol had me carry them for 41 years. Whether you renounce, I said. Furrow and seed, root and yield. The estate is occupied, the field holds title, and Earth will hear you renounce the claim or answer it. One question, 1 day. And cultivator, between us as the 2 oldest men on this hardpan. I picked my hat brim up an inch so he could see my eyes do it. Take the day. He took the day. They are not a hasty people. You don't run an empire on a 500,000-year crop rotation by being quick to decide things. The Vanj Karai disgorged its assay cast in full, and Vigil Command assigned escorts with a courtesy that was itself a message, and the strangest grand tour in the history of either species began an hour before noon, with me riding along in the lead crawler because the cultivator demanded the brand bearer stay where he could see him, and Vigil Command had hoped he would, and I had packed a bag the night before. The assayer called Veth rode in my crawler, the lens-faced one, the one who had spoken out of turn. Slighter than the soldiers, plate the dull color of unpolished tin, upper hands never still, forever folding and unfolding a strip of tally cloth. We were 4 kilometers out from the landing line running east toward the herds before the Saruthi did the second thing that morning that no Saruthi had ever done on Earth. The assayer asked a question. The brand, Veth said, lenses on me, voice pitched under the engine noise as if shame had a volume. Your blood carries the working brand of Estate 993. Our records hold what the brand means. Do yours?
Yes, I said all of it?
All of it, I said. We know what you bred us for. We know what the quotas were. We dug up the tally houses, assayer. We read the ledgers, every column. The tally cloth went still in the upper hands. The lenses turned away, out the slit window, toward the grass. Then the question the marshal will ask, Veth said, is not the question I would fear if I were the first cultivator. No? No. I would fear the question your people have already answered. The lenses came back around to me. 500,000 years, and you kept the ledgers. You did not burn them. A creature that burns the ledger wants to forget. A creature that keeps it is waiting for the audit. I looked at the assayer of the Saruthi Combine for a long moment, and then I faced front and watched the grass come at us through the windscreen, gold to the horizon, every blade of it accounted for. First smart thing anybody said all day, I told him. We were 20 minutes east of the landing line when the cultivator tried his first trick, and I wanted on the record that I admired the workmanship even as I watched it fail. 3 skiffs left the Vanjkarai's dorsal bays, without clearance, without announcement, and without lights, on the far side of the hull from our escort lifters, running low and fast in 3 directions, 1 north over the pole, 1 west across the ocean terminator, 1 south toward the ice. Stealth-built, all 3, mast silent, skinned in something that drank radar and shed heat in buried pulses. Their orders, our intercepts showed later, were simple. Get out from under the demonstration. Find the real planet. The cultivator had spent half a morning being shown things in sequence by a stage manager, and he was old enough and sharp enough to know it. And so he did exactly what I would have done in his place. He sent 3 honest pairs of eyes to look at something we hadn't dressed. Tio let them fly for 50 minutes. She told me afterward that the duration was chosen the way everything that day was chosen, on a page written long before either of us. Let the probe run long enough to believe it is succeeding. The skiffs crossed 2,000 kilometers each, sampling, recording, transmitting nothing, saving it all for the ride home. The northern one mapped what it read as empty tundra and was in fact the roof gardens of the Selwyn Arcology, 400 meters of engineered permafrost over 2 million people who like a cold view. The western one skimmed an ocean it logged as barren, directly down the center line of the Pacific shipway, between submerged yards building hulls the size of the thing its pilot had crossed space in, none of which its instruments were permitted to notice. The southern one made it to the ice shelf and hovered, drinking in a continent of clean white silence, and never once saw the breech doors under the snow, because the veil does its finest work at close range, and the southern polar yards are where we keep the hulls we have never named in public at all. Then the hour was up, and Earth picked all 3 of them out of the air at the same instant, gently, the way you take eggs out of straw. We watched it from the crawler. The whole convoy halted on a rise with the feeds patched through. Wardenry lifters had been riding 200 meters above each skiff since the moment it cleared its bay, station keeping in the same veil shadow the skiffs thought they were hiding in. And on the minute they simply made themselves visible, dropped grapple fields, and took hold. No shots, no demands. The pilot's transmissions, decrypted that evening, are in the museum at the spine now, and the Northern Pilots is the one everybody quotes. 4 words in the flat Serothi register of an honest professional reporting his own end. They were always here. The lifters carried the skiffs back to the flats, slung underneath like calves brought in off the range, set them down in front of the tiller ship's main ramp without a scratch on them, released and lifted away. Nothing was said about it on any band. That was the part, Veth told me much later, that did the damage. A power that protests a trespass can be negotiated with. A power that returns your spies fueled and unharmed, without comment, is telling you that the trespass cost it nothing and taught you nothing, and that it has no interest in even pretending otherwise. The cultivator took the report standing in the open crawler hatch, read it twice, and looked back along our dust trail toward the west, where his westernmost skiff was just then visible coming home under somebody else's wings. He said one thing, not to me, not to anyone, and the crawl caught it anyway. The pen was built before the animal was bred, he said. Assess what that means. Someone assess what that means. Nobody volunteered, and the convoy rolled on, and I sat with the phrase a while myself, because he had it exactly backward and exactly right at the same time, and the distinction was the whole day's lesson in miniature. We had not built the pen first. They had. They built it 500,000 years ago, around a planet of useful animals, and then they left, and the animals spent the whole long fallow learning one trade above every other trade. Fences. How they fail, how they hold, whom they serve. The veil, the ring, the dark squadrons, the gun rings sleeping under the hardpan. Every piece of the provision is the same single thought, worked in different materials. Never again does anyone close a gate on this world from the outside. While we rode, the intercept crews were reading the tiller ship's outbound queue, and what they found there reached my crawler as a flagged summary an hour later, and it told us more about our visitor than the skiffs had told him about us. The Vanj Karai's signal cast had drafted the first report to the reaping train 3 separate times that morning, and all 3 drafts were sitting in the queue, composed, sealed, and unsent. The first draft, timestamped just after landfall, declared the estate fallow and the title clean, and recommended the train begin its inward burn. The second, drafted an hour after my tower lights came on, declared anomalous occupation by feral stock, recommendation pending. The third, drafted while the convoy sat on the overlook above the spine with the home fleet hanging in the noon sky, was different in kind from the other 2. It contained no finding at all. It was a raw transcript, censor truth, unannotated, the city, the hulls, the ring, the herd tags, the managed water, the old man at the threshold who spoke the furrow tongue, all of it laid out flat without one word of conclusion, and at the end of it a single line in the cultivator's own register, the line that told me we were dealing with a serious man, and the day was going to end hard. The line read, "Doctrine requires a finding the instruments will not support. Hold the train. I am going to look at the rest of it." He knows, I said to Veth, when the summary finished crawling across my board. Whatever he says out loud the rest of the day, he's known since the overlook. The estate doesn't exist anymore. There's a country where his deed says there's a field. He is known longer than that. The assayer's lenses were turned out the slit window, east, toward the grass. You read our drafts, Warden, so read mine. I filed my finding before the second dawn, while the convoy was still forming up. It is one line as well, a pause, and the tally cloth moved through 4 hands, over and over like a rope a man checks before he trusts his weight to it. I wrote, "The question is no longer what the field has become. The question is what the farmer is, in a place that no longer needs one, and whether he can be made to understand it before he forces the field to answer it for him." The convoy ground on east through the gold afternoon, and ahead of us, a long way off still, I could just make out the dust of the herds. The herds broke them first, in a small way. We crested the rise above the Okafor grazing lease, and there they were, 40,000 head of engineered bison moving across the gold like a brown river, and 2 range riders sitting their horses on the ridgeline against the sky, and the cultivator's command crawler stopped dead for 6 minutes while his cast argued about the horses. Not the bison, the horses. Their ledgers had horses in them, you see, estate stock, haulage cast, bred small and obedient. The animals on that ridge were 17 hands of muscle carrying armed riders who sat them like the planet belonged to them, and some assay cast officer in the second crawler kept transmitting over and over that the haulage stock should not carry the labor stock, that the categories did not permit it, and nobody answered him, because there was no answer the categories permitted. The riders watched us pass. The nearer one, a woman with a carbine across her saddle bow, touched 2 fingers to her hat brim at my crawler, and I returned it, and Veth watched the whole exchange like a man reading a sentence in a language he was suddenly not sure he spoke. "The animal rider signaled you," Veth said. "Rank?" Manners, I said. She doesn't work for me. Nobody out here works for me. That's her family's lease and her family's herd. And if your column had crossed her wire without the wardenry clearing it, she'd have been within her rights to be unpleasant about it. Rights? Veth repeated, the way you'd handle an unfamiliar tool, checking the weight of it. The morning's second blow was the spine, and Vigil Command paced the reveal like the professionals they are. We ran east 2 hours with the veil peeling back grid square by grid square ahead of us, never behind us, so that the Serothi understood with each kilometer that the wilderness they had essayed from orbit was being handed back to them relabeled, and then we came up out of the Carrion Hills through Tanger Pass, and the land fell away, and there it was. Meridian Spine. The city. I have lived under it my whole life, and I will not pretend I see it the way they saw it, coming on it cold from a dead sky. 800 kilometers of it filled the eastern horizon. Towers like geological events, terraced arcologies stepping down to the old coast. The whole of it veined with light even at noon, and above it, riding their moorings at 12 kilometers up, the home fleet, warships. Kilometers-long hulls in matte gray, dozens of them in the visible band alone, hanging over their city in the daylight the way mountains hang over a valley, and every one of them had been on station, silent, while the Vanskarai burned down through the atmosphere believing itself alone over a feral world. The convoy stopped without anyone ordering it. Serothi came out of the crawlers and stood on the road in their gray gold plate, 6, then 20, then all of them, and they looked, and nobody transmitted anything at all. The cultivator walked to the overlook rail and stood apart, with his lower hands gripping the rail, and the rail is old wardenry iron, and it creaked under what his grip was doing to it. I gave him 3 minutes and then went and stood beside him at a neighborly distance. Population of the spine is 210 million. I said conversational. It's our 4th largest. We numbered them in the order we built them, so when your assay cast files its report tonight, the number that matters isn't 210 million. It's 4th, the hulls. His voice had something new in it, a flattening, like ground that has begun to admit it might not hold. Above the city, name their class. Vigil class. We name the individual hulls for deserts. That near one is Atacama. I let him look at her, 9.5 kilometers of her, hove to over a city of 210 million like a sword laid across the back of a chair. Your tiller ship is a fine piece of work, cultivator. I mean that. You don't keep machinery running 500,000 years without knowing your trade. But I watched you land this morning, and so did she. Atacama was on your descent corridor the whole way down with her batteries cold, because her captain's orders were the same orders every gun on and around this planet has stood under for 6,000 years. No first blood. You were never alone in our sky for 1 second, and you were never in danger in it either, and I need you to understand that both of those things were on purpose. His eye plates shuddered, twice. The breathing slits had gone to a slow, deep cycle, a rhythm I'd learned later was what a Serothi does instead of going pale. Talak permitted 3 findings, he said, almost to himself. In the register, the crawl flagged as litany. The stock perished and the estate lies fallow. The stock endures and remains stock. The stock rose and will display its rising as all risen things display. He turned from the rail and looked down at me, 3 meters of him, and for the first time since the hard pan he spoke to me as if I were the larger one. There is no 4th finding, brand bearer. What does doctrine call a power that veils itself and waits? Ours calls it the provision, I said. Yours doesn't call it anything. That's why you're losing the morning, cultivator. You came 11 trillion kilometers with 3 findings in your pocket, and the truth isn't any of them. The afternoon was the plow, and the plow was the wound. Vigil Command saved it for last with intent, and I will set down what they showed and keep it brief, because the showing itself was brief. That was the discipline of it. We flew, this time, wardenry lifters with the Serothi delegation strapped in like freights south and west over the flats to Engine Site 1, where the desert opens into the great excavation, 30 kilometers across, terraced like an amphitheater, and at the floor of it, the thing we found 9,000 years ago and have never once moved. A Serothi following engine, 11 kilometers of glacier driver, the machine that had iced the world to scour their leavings and reset their field. Their machine. The plow. Except it wasn't theirs anymore, and that was the wound. Around it, into it, through it, ran 9,000 years of human works, conduits as wide as rivers, scaffold cities, the whole vast carcass instrumented and harnessed, and the cultivators cast read the energy ledger off their own instruments and could not file it, because the plow was running. We had restarted their glacier driver, rebuilt to our purposes, and for the past 2,000 years it had been the regulating heart of Earth's climate engine, breathing for the planet, steadying the monsoons, holding the ice caps at the line we chose. The instrument of the fallowing, the machine sent to erase us, was down in that pit keeping our harvests gentle. You yoked it, Veth said beside me, lenses on the pit floor. Tally cloth motionless. The plow of estate 993. You yoked it to the field. We're a working people, I said. It was the biggest thing anybody ever left lying around our farm. Of course we yoked it. It iced your world. The codex is plain about the fallowing. We have never hidden the fallowing. The fallowing is lawful. The assayer stopped. The lenses came around to me. You're dead. The fallowing's dead. The ledgers ran too. And the crawl gave me the number in their notation, and I will not write it here because we have our own count, and ours is higher, and I had stood in the tally where we keep it, and the Serothi had not. Not yet. Tomorrow, I said. If your cultivator answers the question wrong, you'll see where we keep that number. Pray to the rotation he answers it right. But the cultivator was already answering it, in his own way, down on the viewing terrace with the wind off the excavation pulling at him. I watched him stand looking at his civilization's plow in our harness for the better part of an hour, and I am an old man who has watched faces for a living in 2 services, and I watched his go somewhere I recognized. It is the place a proud man goes when the evidence has finished beating him, and the pride is all he has left to spend. He turned to his signal officer, and he did not lower his voice, because a man spending his last pride wants witnesses. Wake the reaping train, he said. The words went through the Serothi delegation like current through wire. Veth's tallycloth tore, upper hands jerking, and the protest the assayer started got one syllable out before the cultivator's lower hand rose and closed it. Our intercepts had the order on the combine band already, punched through relay, outbound at light speed toward the cold edge of the system where it would find what had been drifting there, dark and patient, since before the Vanjkarai ever entered our sky, the rest of them, the harvest fleet. 800 hulls of the Serothi combine, riding silent beyond the outer planets, waiting for the tillership's one-word verdict on whether Earth was ready for the plow. The cultivator looked down the terrace at me, and his voice carried flat across the wind. You kept your ledgers, brand-bearer, he said. We keep ours. The codex permits no fourth finding, and so I will make the assay true by hand. Stock that rises is blight. Blight is burned. And the field is sown again. The train comes. I looked back at him for a long breath. Behind my collar, the vigil channel was talking very quietly, in numbers. Nowhere on it could I hear a single raised voice. Order's gone out then, I said. Lights fast, cultivator, faster than regret. How long until your train hears it? 11 hours, 11 hours. I nodded slow and settled my hat. Then you've got 11 hours to learn the last thing we dug out of your engine. And I am sorrier than you know that you'll learn it this way. Your train's been talking in its sleep, out there in our dark, for 9 years. We never woke it. I started up the terrace steps and gave him the rest over my shoulder, because some sentences should be delivered like freight, dropped and left. It hasn't been alone out there either. They flew us back to the favorite end of the afternoon, and the convoy ran silent the whole way. And I sat across from an assayer who folded and refolded a torn strip of tallycloth and said nothing until the lifters dropped through the pass and the dry lake came into view with the tiller ship crouched on it, hold lights burning amber in the dusk. 9 years, Veth said then. You said the train has not been alone for 9 years. Assay that claim for me, Warden. Plainly, plainly. I leaned my head back against the hull webbing. Your combine staged its harvest fleet in our outer dark a decade before it sent the Vanjkarai in, because your doctrine says you survey before you plow. Our doctrine says the same thing, assayer. And our doctrine has shorter supply lines. The day your train made its first station-keeping burnout past the ice line, 3 vigil squadrons left their moorings. They've ridden alongside your 800 hulls ever since, dark at a courteous distance, the way a warden rides the boundary of his own range. Your fleet has been pacing in our pasture for 9 years, and the only reason it doesn't know is that we saw no reason to be rude before today. The tallycloth stopped moving. 800 hulls, Veth said. Shadowed for 9 years, undetected. The train's pickets are not stockwork, Warden. They are the combine's finest. I believe you, I said. Nobody on our side has ever said your people weren't fine engineers. You want the difference between us. It isn't the engineering. I tapped my own chest over the brand his machines had read that morning. You build for the harvest, assayer. Every machine you own exists to take a yield off something that can't refuse you. We built for the day the landlord came back. Every machine we own exists for one morning, and this is the morning, and that's the difference. Yield engineering versus doctrine engineering. Your hulls are tools, ours are an answer. The lifters put us down inside the warden boundary as full dark came on, and the flats at night had changed. The veil was off the whole grid now, dropped by command across 400 kilometers, and the sky the Serothi walked out under was Earth's true sky, the one we see. The ring of bright architecture from horizon to horizon, the moving stars that are not stars, the slow constellations of dock light at the Lagrange yards, the home fleet's running lights stacked over the eastern ranges. 600 reap wardens stood on the hardpan under all of it in formation, waiting for their cultivator, and I watched helmet after helmet tilt back, rank by rank, discipline losing to sky. I slept 4 hours in my own bunk in the tower, because an old soldier eats and sleeps when the schedule allows, or he is no use to the schedule. At 0340 my console woke me, and it was Tio herself, not the watch officer, and that told me before her voice did. He's testing the boundary, she said. Get to the gallery. The tiller ship had run out a weapon in the dark. Just one. A culling lance, dorsal mount, a strip mining tool by ancestry, the beam they used on estates to thin a herd or burn a blighted field, and the logs would show later that the cultivator ordered it run out, charged, and aimed while his own assayer caste filed formal dissent and was overruled. He chose his targets the way a foreman chooses, by the ledger. The nearest concentration of unsanctioned stock, the Okafor lease, the herd, the riders, and the nearest piece of the occupying claim, Warden Post Echo Fower, 60 kilometers up the boundary from my tower, where the duty roster that night carried 3 names. I knew all 3. You served 41 years on one range. You know every name it ever carries, but one of them was Dane Holloway, who had been my loader on the Kalahari battery 50 years before, who had followed me into the wardenry when our gun was decommissioned, who owed me 11 hands of cards and a fishing trip. What the cultivator wanted, the analyst wrote afterward, was a finding. The morning had taken his 3 findings away, and he was a man of doctrine, so in the dark he reached for the oldest instrument his doctrine owned. Hurt the field and see whether it screams or strikes. If Earth's answer was a scream, the stock was still stock. If Earth's answer was annihilation, the blight stood, the train was justified, and he could die a correct man. He fired 1 lance, 11 seconds of beam, and he split it between a bison herd and a warden post. And then he stood on his command deck and waited to be told what we were. The beam took Echo Fower off the earth down to the slab. It took the Okafor North herd 2,000 head, and it took the line shack at the lease boundary. And the line shack was supposed to be empty at that hour and was not, because the 2 Okafor brothers had ridden out at midnight to calm the herds the Sky Show had spooked. 5 people, 3 wardens, 2 riders, between one breath and the next 11 seconds of someone else's doctrine. I stood on my gallery and watched the lance light die off the northern horizon, and I am going to write the next part carefully, because it is the part of that night I am oldest about, and the part I would have a reader understand above all the fleet tonnage and the orbital. Engineering. Earth did not scream, and Earth did not annihilate. Earth answered the way the provision had always said we would answer. The doctrine drilled into every battery crew for 6,000 years, the sentence I had stood under when I was a gunner younger than the morning. Measured, total, and exact. No first blood, and after first blood, the precise hand, Atacama answered. She was still on station over the spine, 1,100 kilometers east, and her log shows her solution was already current, because her solutions on every weapon the Vanj Karai owned had been current since dawn. 4 seconds after the culling lance went cold, one of her dorsal batteries spoke once. The bolt came down out of the eastern sky like a seam of daylight opened in the dark, and it took the lance mount off the tiller ship's spine the way a surgeon takes a growth, cauterized, contained, the wound glowing dull red on 9 kilometers of hull that was otherwise untouched, no secondary explosions, no spread. The hold lights didn't so much as flicker. 600 reap wardens on the hardpan saw the weapon above them simply cease to exist inside a column of light too brief to leave an after image, and the silence that followed it was the loudest thing I have heard in 84 years. Then every light on the flats came on. The veil had hidden more than sky. Gun positions woke along the whole rim of the dry lake. Rising out of ground, the assay engines had tasted and called dirt. Ring upon ring of them, the batteries of the Calder designated range that the range had been designed around from the first survey, every barrel already laid on the tiller ship and every barrel cold, and on the wide band in Old Serothi, Vigil Marshal Tio's voice went out across the hardpan with no anger in it at all, which was the most frightening way it could have sounded, and I know because I watched 600 soldiers of the Combine hear it. Van Karai, this is the Vigil. You have taken 5 lives under our law and lost a weapon under yours, and the exchange rate displeases us. Here is the accounting. Your lance is gone. Your train is shadowed. Your sky is closed. Nothing on or above this world will fire on you again unless you fire, and if you fire, what answers will not be a battery. A pause, and the pause was part of the message, and then first cultivator, the question has not changed, but the day is over. You will attend the accounting at dawn, at the threshold of your estate house, and you will see what your codex bought the last time it ran this field, and then you will give Earth your answer. Bring your assayers. Bring your dead forms. Wardenry, stand down the rim. The gun rings went dark again all at once, obedient as breath. The tiller ship sat on the lake bed with one small red wound cooling on her spine, and inside my collar the warden channel was reading off the names from Echo 4 in the flat voice we keep for it, and I stood on the gallery in the cold with my hands on the rail, an old man on a tower over the oldest battlefield on Earth, which had been a battlefield for one beam's width of a single night and was now a courtroom again. I will not write much about Dane. He was owed a fishing trip. Let that stand for the rest. We were the last two of the Kalahari's old crew, and the wardenry is where the lattice sends its gunners to grow old usefully. And he had laughed at me for taking the Tower 9 post, the famous one, the porch light post, said I only wanted it so I'd be first in line if the landlord ever knocked. He was right, and I was, and the landlord knocked, and the bill for the knock went to Echo 4. There is no arithmetic that makes that come out fair. There is only the provision and what it bought at dawn. At 0500, with the east going gray, Veth came to the foot of my tower alone, on foot helmetless, carrying the torn tally cloth in both upper hands like an offering, and stood at the boundary gate until I came down. The names of your 5, the assayer said. I am asking for them, not the Combine I looked at the lens faces a long moment. Then I gave the names slowly and watched 4 hands write them into Serothi tally knots, the script their ledgers use for yield, for loss, for things the rotation must be shown. First human names ever entered in a Combine ledger as anything but stock. Your cultivator did that with a thinning tool, I said. At dawn he sees the tally. Will he renounce? I do not know what he will do, Veth said. I have begun to know what you will. There had been no sleep between the strike and the assayer's visit, and there was none after. The hour before an answer is the longest hour there is, and the wardenry spent it the way the wardenry spends every hour, which is to say working, because the dead were ours, and the ground was ours, and nobody else was going to do it. The heavy lifter reached the Echo 4 slab at 0410 with the recovery team and the duty chaplain, and I rode along because rank has few privileges on a range, but this one is absolute. Nobody tells the senior warden he can't go get his own. There is not much to say about what 11 seconds of culling lance leaves of a post, and I will not say it. We found the duty log fused but legible. The last entry timed 0339, routine, a note about the herds being restless under the strange sky. Dane's handwriting steady as a fence rail right up to the edge of the page. I have the log now. The wardenry let me keep it when I retired, against every regulation on the books, and I consider it the only theft of my career and a bargain at the price. While we worked the slab, the riders were working the lease, and that is the part of the night I want written down more than my own part, because it is the part the Serothi never saw, and it is the truest thing about us I know. The Okafor family lost 2 sons and 2,000 head in 11 seconds, and by 0430 every rider from every lease inside 100 kilometers was on that burned ground in the dark, unasked, moving the surviving herds to clean grass, cutting fence where the fire lines needed it, dragging water tanks behind their own machines. Nobody called them. There is no protocol page that summons them. The range called them, the way it is called neighbors since before anybody built anything in orbit at all, and when the senior Okafor rode up the line at first light to where I stood at the boundary wire, what he wanted to know was not whether Earth would avenge his sons. What he wanted to know was whether the wardenry needed his remaining riders and his lifters for the day's work, whatever the day's work turned out to be. I want to be honest about the rest of it, though, because the record should not pretend we are made of different material than other men. There was anger on that boundary at dawn, real anger, armed anger. 40 riders sat their horses inside the wire with carbines across their saddle bows, looking out at 600 reap wardens standing formation on the lake bed, and the distance between them was 9 kilometers, and the will to close it was thinner than I have ever felt it. A young rider, one of the Okafor cousins, walked her horse up the wire to me and asked, in a voice with gravel and salt in it, why the guns under the desert had taken the weapon and not the hand that aimed it. And every rider in earshot turned in the saddle for the answer. Because the hand is going to do something worse than die, I told her, loud enough to carry. It's going to stand in front of what we keep under this range, with its whole fleet watching, and find out what we are. Your family's been on this lease 11 generations, so you know what the provision is. It was never a promise that we wouldn't be hurt. It was a promise that we would never once in 500,000 years do the thing they bred us to do. They bred stock, girl. Stock bolts or stock tramples. We are going to stand here in good order and build them for the herd, and that is the most dangerous thing any species in this galaxy has ever seen come over a hill. I looked down the wire at 40 armed riders on burned grass. Hold the line with me, not for their sake, for the 5. Don't let the last thing the Lance did be making us simple. They all held. It cost them, and I logged in my report that it cost them, because the protocol halls in their towers needed to know what the boundary paid that morning to keep their pages clean. The cities held too, and that was its own kind of answer, prepared like everything else. The strike logs show that within 90 seconds of the lance firing, every civil defense system on the planet had woken, assessed, and stood back down, and not one city dimmed a light. The spine burned all night at full glitter, 210 million people going about their evening under the moorings of the home fleet, theaters open, trams running, and the analysts tell me this was among the first things the Sarothi command cast could not file. A world that took a military strike on its surface and did not so much as draw its curtains. Their doctrine read populations the way their assay engines read soil, by the tremor. Earth declined to tremble. Earth had drilled not trembling for 300 generations. The way you drill anything you intend to be able to do under fire. Out on the lake bed, the 600 stood their formation through the whole of the night, and our watch officers, who had expected them to withdraw up the ramps after the answer, logged instead a thing none of our xenologists had predicted. At 0420, the Reap Warden commander walked out alone in front of his formation, removed his helmet, set it on the hardpan, and stood bareheaded facing north, toward the burn scar 60 kilometers away, and held that posture until dawn. One by one through the dark, by squads his 600 did the same. Our intercepts caught no order given. The xenologist argued for a week about what it was, and then somebody thought to simply ask Veth, who looked at the imagery for a long time and said one word in the furrow tongue, a field right word, the one their harvest crews speak over ground that has been taken out of rotation by someone's error. The nearest our language comes, Veth said, is fallow shame. It is not apology. They do not have apology yet. It is what the soil feels, the assayer said, when the foreman has cut a furrow that should not have been cut. T.O. called me at 0540 while the recovery lifter was still on the slab, and her question was the morning's last piece of choreography, and I have thought about it every day since. The accounting convenes in 40 minutes, Warden. The protocol halls want the 5 carried at it. Photographs in the arms of their own. The xenologists say it will read to the Sarothi as a tally presented for audit, the strongest form of claim in their law, and the halls are split on whether it shames our dead to use them so. You knew 3 of the 5. I'm giving you the call. I stood on the fused slab of Echofar with the log book in my hand and Dane's last steady line of handwriting in my eyes, and I did not have to think about it as long as I expected to. Carry them, I said. Dane stood this boundary 50 years so that whatever came over it would be met with evidence instead of fire. He's evidence now. He'd call it a promotion. I looked north where the sky was going gray over the burn. Carry all 5, marshal, and put them in the front rank. Let the landlord audit what 11 seconds of his doctrine bought him, and then let's see his ledger balance. Dawn came up red over the flats. The second dawn of the return, and the accounting convened at the threshold of Estate House 993, which is to say on bare hardpan 400 meters off my tower, because the estate house has been under the desert for 500,000 years, and we had never built anything on top of it. That was deliberate too. You do not build on the place you are keeping for a courtroom. They opened the ground at sunrise. I had known the doors were there my whole career, every warden does, and I had never seen them work. A square kilometer of desert floor unseamed itself and drew back in 8 wedges, dustless, silent, machined to tolerances that made the assay engine stutter, and out of the dark below rose the tally of Calder on its platform into the morning. The Sarothi delegation stood in ranks at the threshold line, the cultivator at their head in full formal plate with his helmet under his arm, and they watched the largest single object their species had ever seen a subject people raise come up out of the earth their codex said was theirs. I will describe it once plainly. The tally is a library. It is 400 meters of basalt and alloy, terraced and on its faces, machined too fine for an unaided eye, it carries the genetic record of the harvested. Every distinct human line the Combine's ledgers logged as taken during the tillage of Earth, recovered from their own tally houses, crossbred against the deep archaeology, named where we could name and numbered where we could not. It is not a tomb. There are no bodies in it. It is not a monument. We did not build it to be looked at. It is evidence assembled over 9,000 years, curated, certified, and kept under the courtroom floor against the day the defendant came home. Around its base, that morning stood the honor watch, 400 wardens and riders and lattice gunners in working clothes, and among them, carried that day in the crook of arms, the 5 photographs from the night. The cultivator walked the tally for 2 hours. The protocol allowed him as long as he wanted, and his assayer cast walked behind him, reading their own notation off our stone, confirming entry after entry against the records the Van Karai carried, and the wide band stayed open the whole time at Earth's insistence, so that every helmet on the flats and every deck of the distant reaping train heard the assayers' voices, hour on hour, saying the Sarothi word that means it conforms, it conforms, it conforms. 11,000 entries before the first discrepancy, and the discrepancy was ours to flag. A line their ledger recorded as cold entire that our archaeology had found surviving. A thin thread of it in the ice shadow of the Anatolian refuges. Earth had logged the correction in their own notation. The assayer reading it stopped and looked at the correction for a long moment, and then read it out, voice unsteady. It conforms, with addendum. The stock's count is better than ours. I stood my post at the threshold and watched the first cultivator of the combine come to the end of the east, face where the carving stops and 400 meters of blank prepared stone runs on, faced and polished and empty. He stood before the blank stone longer than he had stood before any of the carved. Why does the record end in prepared stone, he said, the first words he had spoken in 2 hours. What is the empty face for? Tio answered from the ring, and her voice on the morning band was quiet. And there are sentences a civilization rehearses for thousands of years, and hers came down the sky like one of them. That depends on you, cultivator. We prepared the stone because we are a thorough people, and the provision required us to be ready for every answer you might give. If you renounce, the blank face stays blank, and in 10,000 years it will be a curiosity for schoolchildren, the wall where nothing happened. There is no third use. We carved the past because it happened, cultivator. We will not carve a future unless you insist on making one. The cultivator stood at the blank stone with the morning sun on his formal plate, and his shadow lay across the empty face the way a man's shadow lies across his own bed. And the flats and the ring and the train at the system's edge waited 11 seconds for the master of the Vanchkarai to choose. He chose the way proud men choose, which is to say he chose his pride and called it law. He turned from the stone and put his helmet on, and his voice went out on the combine band in the register of writ, formal, sealed, irreversible under their codex, and our translators ran it flat across the morning. Finding entered. Estate 993 is in blight. The stock has risen against title, slain none, and shown all. The showing is the blight, for stock that can do this once can do it to every estate of the rotation forever. There is no pen for this animal. The field is condemned. A pause, plate still, and then the sentence we had waited 500,000 years to hear them forced to say aloud. The combine cannot hold this title. Therefore the title must burn with the field. Reaping train, general order. Close on earth and commence. The honor watch around the tally did not move. 400 humans in working clothes stood easy while a death sentence was read over their world, and that stillness was not theater. It was the provision, bone deep, the discipline of a people who had read the 11-second future in every drill for generations. The order would take 11 hours to crawl to the train. The train's answer, hulls and fire, would take weeks to fall inward. We stood in a window of time our whole civilization had been engineered around, and inside that window, Earth owned every move on the board, and every man and woman on that hardpan knew it, and not one of us smiled, because 5 photographs stood among us in the crook of arms. Veth broke ranks. The assayer crossed the threshold line in front of 600 reporters, stripped off both lens arrays barefaced into the sun, and committed the act our intercepts had no precedent for in 9,000 years of decoded combine law. Formal counterfinding. Entered by an assayer against a first cultivator on an open band. Counterfinding, Veth said, and the voice cracked and steadied. The field is not in blight. The field is in mastery. The Codex commands the burning of blight. It commands no remedy for mastery, because the Codex never conceived the field could master the farmer. I enter the 4th finding. I enter it under my name and my line's name, and I append the assay. They kept our ledgers when they could have burned them. They yoked our plow to feed their children. They lost 5 souls in the night and answered with 1 cut once and stood down. This is not blight, first cultivator. This is what the rotation looks like when it comes home. Renounce. The cultivator looked at his assayer for a long, plate-still moment. Your finding is noted, he said, and your caste is dissolved. And he turned to his reporting commander and gave the 2nd order of the morning, the one the analysts tell me his doctrine required of him once the writ was sealed, and even so I watched the commander hesitate 1 full second before relaying it. The tiller ship's remaining systems lit, not weapons. She had no weapons left worth the name. Engines. The Vanchkarai began her ground start sequence. 9 kilometers of hull gathering thrust on a dry lakebed 400 meters from the tally of Calder, and her flight plan, broadcast in the clear as their law demanded, named her destination as the reaping train, and her purpose as command of the burning, and her course is straight up through the meridian ring. Warden Voss. Tio's voice, on my private channel, calm as a range morning. Get our people behind the gun line. He's going to make us show the train the difference between a battery and an answer, and I'd have spared him that. For the record, you and your tower are about to have the best view on Earth. For the record beyond that, a breath, the only one I ever heard her take on an open mic, provision holds. No first blood. He has already shed it. Stand by. I walk the honor watch back behind the rim line myself, last man through the gate, And I stopped at the boundary the way I had stopped at it 10,000 mornings, and I looked back once at the tally standing in the sun with its blank stone waiting, and at the 5 photographs going by me in the crook of arms, and at 9 kilometers of returning landlord rising off our lakebed on pillars of fire, certain even now, certain to the end, that somewhere in his codex was a page that made all of this come out his way. The Valkyrie cleared her own dust cloud and climbed. The morning was very clear. Far above her, faint as chalk, the ring waited, and I put my hand on the gate iron and did the gunner's arithmetic one last time, and there was no version of it, none, in which anything that had ever flown was going to matter against what Earth had spent 500,000 years deciding to become. What happened in the next 4 minutes is taught now, I am told, in every staff college we have, and I expect in time it will be taught in theirs. I watched it from my gallery with my hat off. I am not sure when my hat came off. The Valkyrie climbed hard for the ring's underside, and the ring did not fire, and the fleet did not fire, and the gun rings on the flats did not fire, and for 90 seconds I believe the cultivator let himself read our silence as hesitation, because his ship kept transmitting course corrections that assumed she would live. Then she crossed 40 kilometers of altitude. The sealing Earth's law sets for an armed intruder under writ of harm. The line surveyed and published and broadcast to him twice the day before, and Earth stopped being silent, and I learned, 84 years old, standing on a tower I had stood on my whole life, that I had never once seen my own civilization take its hand out of its pocket. The sky ate her. I do not have better words, and I have had time to look for them. There was no barrage, no visible beam, nothing a man could point to and call gunfire. The ring's arc directly above her simply attended to her, the way the analyst's word for it runs, 1,100 kilometers of orbital architecture turning a fraction of its attention downward, and the Valkyrie's drive pillars guttered out as if pinched, and her 9 kilometers of hull went from a ship climbing to a ship held, motionless, impossibly, at 110 kilometers of altitude, gripped in fields we did not know in my grandfather's day how to describe to the public, and still mostly don't. Held and then, with a gentleness that was the single most frightening thing I have witnessed in a long life, turned over, slowly, deliberately. Belly to the stars, spine to the earth, the orientation their own codex uses for a beast presented for inspection, and every deck of her crew hanging in their restraints, staring down out of their viewports at the world that had caught them with one hand. And then Earth took her apart. Not destroyed her, took her apart, in order on the open band, narrating in Old Serothi as it went, and the voice that narrated was not Tio's. It was the Vigil's own system voice, the one that runs the lattice, dispassionate as tide tables. Drive section, it said, and the drive section came away whole, cut along its service seams, and was handed off to tugs that had been alongside, dark, the entire climb. Mast and rid array, it said, and the masts came away. Lance decks decommissioned, it said, and the gutted weapon spine came away in 3 clean lengths. Seat holds and crew decks, preserved, it said, and the heart of the tiller ship, the holds carrying their sleepers and their stores and their living crew, stayed whole and warm and pressurized in the ring's grip, untouched, while 90% of the ship that had carried them was filleted off around them in 21 minutes by a planet that never once raised its voice. They tell me the reaping train heard all of it in real time, our transmission, sent ahead deliberately on Earth's band, faster paperwork than their own order. The train heard its flagship inspected, condemned, and rendered down to a hull core of survivors before the cultivator's burn order ever crawled the last cold kilometers to reach it. The train's 800 hulls received, in one packet, their commander's order to close and burn, the full sensor record of what had answered it, and a single appended line in their own register, the only original sentence Earth added all morning. The Vigil's archivists fought over that line for 9,000 years. Drafts of it are in museums, and in the end, the version that went out was the shortest one ever proposed. This field keeps its own rotation now, stand or be stood down. 800 hulls, 11 hours of light lag away, with 3 Vigil squadrons riding dark off their flanks at courteous range and 9 years of unpaid pasturage between them and the inner system. The train's command cast took 40 minutes to answer, and when the answer came, it was not fire and it was not flight. It was the third thing, the thing Veth had told me in the crawler no Serothi formation had done in the whole history of the rotation. The reaping train struck its drives. All of them, every hull at once, and went cold and waited to be told what it was now. On the lakebed, the 600 grounded reap wardens of the landing force stood under the spectacle of their flagship's deconstruction, and their commander, the one who had hesitated a full second the day before, walked alone to the rim line to the nearest battery and laid his scythe rifle on the ground in front of it with the blade folded, and his 600 followed him by squads, in good order, in silence, until the morning sun lay on a half-kilometer of grounded steel, and the only Sarothi on the flats still standing apart was a bare-faced assayer with a dissolved cast, holding a torn strip of tally cloth, watching the sky hold his civilization the way a warden holds a foundered animal, firmly, and with no joy whatsoever. The cultivator did not surrender, and I want the record I leave to be exact about what he did instead, because it was not nothing and I am too old to pretend an enemy's end can't be worth describing. When the Ring's tugs came alongside the preserved crew corps to take her under tow, the command deck refused the line. Sorath Kaven invoked the page of his codex that he had been steering for, I think, since the overlook above the spine, the page for a foreman whose field has ruined him, the last furrow, the writ of self-accounting. He transmitted his ledger, complete, unedited, including the night order that killed 5 of ours, including his own annotations, which is how we know that at the end he wrote against his own finding. Blight finding entered in error, the last annotation reads. The error was the pens. The animal was never penned. And then he sealed the command deck against his own crew, alone, and opened it to the black. And the Combine's oldest serving cultivator went out of the rotation the way their farmers have gone out of it for 1,000,000 years, with his boots on his own deck and his ledger filed. We did not interfere. The provision is plain about that too. A man's own death, harming none, is his own field. The Ring held the course steady while he went, and then took the 1,100 of his crew who chose otherwise under tow, alive, everyone. Tio called me on the private channel as the tugs lit for the Lagrange yards, and her voice had 11 hours of light lag arithmetic in it and something else underneath. And it took me a moment to name the something else as grief, the command kind, the kind that is nowhere to be put down. 5 of ours, she said. 1 of theirs by his own hand and 1,100 breathing. 800 hulls cold in the dark with their drives struck. Warden, you stood the porch light post longer than anyone living. I'm asking you before I ask the protocol halls, what do we do with a surrendered harvest? I stood on my gallery and looked north, where the burn scar from the culling lance ran across the Okafor lease like a brand on the land, 60 kilometers of it, with the dust of the herds dying still hanging gold in the morning light, and I gave her the only answer 41 years on that boundary had left in me. What we planned to do, Marshal. The provision never had a page for revenge. I've read all of it. We bury our 5. We build a combine for the herd. I watched the tugs climb, bright morning stars rising the wrong way, hauling 1,100 of the people who had come to burn my world up to the safest harbor it had ever offered anyone. And then we do the thing they'll never see coming, the thing the whole 500,000 years was for. We show them the field they made, Marshal, all of it. And we send them home to tell the rotation what's grown here. The train's full answer would not reach us until the 3rd morning. Light is the one courier nobody bribes. But an older light arrived that same afternoon, 11 hours stale, and gave the flats its last lesson of the day, because the events it carried had happened out in the cold before the flagship ever began her climb. When the wake order had reached the reaping train at 3 in the morning our time, 800 hulls had received it, and 788 had done what disciplined hulls do, which is spin up and await the deploy sequence. 12 had not waited. The Combine called them the Reap Vanguard, a zealot squadron, old doctrine crews who had petitioned for the Earth rotation across 4 generations because their lines held grievance shares in Estate 993, and the analysts say their commander lit his drives within 90 seconds of the wake order, no deploy sequence, no escort screen, 12 hulls burning inward alone for the inner system and the field their great-grandsires had farmed. 11 hours later, the light of what happened next came down our sky, and Vigil Command put it on every public band on Earth, raw, unnarrated, and I stood on my gallery with the whole boundary watching, and saw the thing my own service had been a small part of building. The Vanguard burned for 40 minutes alone in what its crews believed was empty dark, and then the dark stood up around them. The Squadron Namib had ridden off their flank at courteous range for 9 years, and she ended the courtesy all at once, lights blazing on, full active sweep, 11 Vigil hulls, resolving out of nothing in perfect englobement with their batteries already amidst firing solutions. The Vanguard's machines reported as total. No shot, just arithmetic arriving all at once, from every direction including the 2 a fleet, has no instinct to guard. The Vanguard's 12 hulls cut thrust inside a minute, all but 1. The records say her name meant something like Furrow True, an old hull crewed by the angriest of the grievance lines, and she alone lit her lance capacitors, and Namib's flag did not even shift formation. 1 escort put a single disabling cut across Furrow True's drive route, surgical as the Atacama's morning work, and the Vasilit ship went dark and drifting with every soul aboard alive, and a Vigil tug had her under tow before her crew finished their casualty count of nobody. What undid the watching Sarothi on the lakebed, Veth told me afterward, was not the englobement, though the englobement entered their staff literature within the year. It was the recording Namib transmitted to the stalled Vanguard while the tug made fast, a recording the Vanguard crews had no way to know was 9 years old. Their own squadron's drive signatures, logged and named, hull by hull, from the very first station-keeping burn any of them had ever made in our outer dark. 9 years of their watches, their drills, their secret proximity sweeps that had swept across Vigil hulls and read them as void. Namib sent it without comment, the way we had returned the skiffs without comment, and the Vanguard rode out the tow in a silence our intercepts described as religious. On the flats, the grounded 600 watched all of it on the feeds we did not prevent them from receiving, and that evening, their commander came to the rim line under an open hand, which is their parley sign, and asked to speak with the wardenry, not the Vigil. The distinction was noted in 300 staff papers since, but it wasn't complicated. The Vigil had beaten them. The wardenry was the boundary, and the boundary was where a foreman's business had always been done, and he was a foreman a very long way from home, whose flagship had just been rendered down to a towed core in front of his entire profession. Tio gave the parley to me. I walked out to the wire in the long red light with my hat on and my hands empty, and the reporting commander stood across from me, bareheaded since 0420 and bareheaded still, and we had, by the Crawl's account, the strangest conversation in its archives, because it was about logistics. He wanted to surrender his formation's stores. Doctrine again. A force whose finding has collapsed holds no foraging right, and his 600 had water for 9 days and their own dead morning shame, and he would not forage on ground his lance had burned. And so he stood at my wire at sunset and asked in the stiff old register what the price of water was on Estate 993 for men who had no claim to it. Water's free on this range, I told him. Always has been. It comes with the ground, and the ground isn't yours, so the water can't be either. You'll drink ours. I let him hold that a moment, and then I gave him the other half, because the protocol halls had drafted me the page that afternoon, and for once I agreed with every line of it. Your formation owes this boundary a different debt. 2,000 head of engineered stock, 2 centuries of breeding line, and a lease family's livelihood burned by your command's weapon under your command's order. Earth doesn't take blood for blood, Commander. We find it doesn't compound well. We take work. Your 600 are going to spend their parole rebuilding what the Lance unmade, under the writer's direction, at the writer's pace, to the writer's standard. Fence by fence. Your people are farmers under all that plate as I hear it. I looked past him at the half-kilometer of grounded scythe rifles glittering in the last light. Show us. He was silent for a long moment. Serothi faces are hard for us to read, but I had been reading them for 2 days by then, and what moved through his was not humiliation. It was something that had no business on a face that morning, and it took me until he spoke to name it as relief. A man whose doctrine has died gets handed a new thing to be, and the new thing was old. Work, debt, ground, a standard to meet. His lower hands made the sign our crawl renders as the furrow accepts. The Codex has no page for this, he said. No, I said. Ours does. We had a long time to write it, Commander, and the writing of it is the whole story of this place. 500,000 years is enough time to plan any revenge a heart could hold. We spent it deciding what we'd do instead. You're standing in the answer. Go tell your 600 they start at the north fence at dawn. He went, and from the third morning on, any rider who looked north from the Okafor lease saw a sight no projection in any protocol hall had ever quite dared to draw. 600 soldiers of the Serothi Combine stringing wire and setting posts on burned grass under a wardenry flag, working off a debt in the oldest currency there is, while above them, faint as chalk in the daylight, the ring kept its watch over all of us alike. We buried our 5 on the 3rd day, under the rim of the range, in the Warden ground where the Calder posting has buried its own since the first survey. The whole boundary stood it, wardens, riders, gunners down from the lattice on bereavement rotation, the Okafor lease families in their church clothes. Tio came down from the ring in person, which marshals do not do, and stood in the line like anyone, which marshals do not do either. The protocol halls had argued about whether to broadcast the funeral to the cold, fleet sitting at the system's edge, and in the end Earth did, unnarrated, a single fixed camera in the wind, because the provision's authors had written one sentence on the matter that ended the argument. They should see the price of the lesson and see that we paid it without once raising our voice. Dane went into the ground beside gunners he'd have liked. I spoke the loader's call over him. The old Kalahari battery form, stand clear, breach closed, and the line answered the way a gun crew answers, and that is all I will set down about it, except this. 1100 Serothi in the Lagrange holding decks asked through Veth to observe a minute of engine silence at the hour of the burial. Their request gave the hour in our reckoning, correctly converted, which meant somebody up there had learned to read our clocks in 3 days. We granted it. The yards logged every Sarothi system aboard going voluntarily dark for 61 seconds, 1 second over, and when the yards asked about the discrepancy, the answer came back in tally knots. The extra is for the herd. The messengers were chosen in the second week. That had been the plan in the protocol halls, since before my grandmother stood her first watch. The page of the provision titled in the dry way of its authors, Disposition of the Returned, a few would be sent back. Not all and not none. All would have been mercy without a witness. None would have been a silence the rotation could fill with flattering lies. A few, chosen, shown everything, and sent home slow across the dark with the truth in their holds, because of all the weapons Earth had spent 500,000 years building. The one the provision trusted most was a debriefing the enemy's own officers would believe. They chose 11, Veth first, reinstated by our insistence on the grounds that Earth recognized the fourth finding even if the Codex didn't, and 10 more from the crew and the train's command cast, selected by Sarothi ballot under our supervision, which was itself a lesson we made sure they noticed. Pick your own truth-tellers, we will not pick them for you. For 100 days we showed them the field. I went along for some of it, the brand-bearer in his range coat, because Veth asked, and because Tio had learned the value of keeping one old man in the frame for scale. I will not catalog the 100 days, the record exists. I will keep 3 pieces of it. In the second week they stood in the turbine galleries of the plow, 11 Sarothi in the harnessed heart of their own glacier driver, and the duty engineer that shift was a woman whose family had worked engine sight, one for 200 years, and one of the train's officers asked her, through the crawl, how Earth had borne the cost of converting it. She didn't understand the question. He rephrased, the cost, the diverted yield, the generation spent on a machine that grows no food and fires no shot. She understood and laughed before she could stop herself and apologized, and then said the thing the messenger reports would quote across 200 estates of the rotation within a decade. It does grow food, she said. It grows the weather the food grows in. You people keep asking what our weapons cost us. Almost everything we built is a plowshare. It just stands up straight when it has to. That's the whole trick, sirs. There isn't another one. In the 7th week, they were shown the shipyards at the 2nd Lagrange, and the train's senior officer, a reporting commander of 9 campaigns, stood at the viewport in silence for the length of the slips, hull after hull after hull, in the building ways, and finally asked the question Earth had been waiting 3 months for one of them to ask. How many fleets like the home fleet exist? The yardmaster answered him with the truth, which I am still not cleared to write here, and the commander took the number the way a man takes a blow he is braced for, and then asked the better question, the one that proved the messengers had been chosen well. Why did you show me? You could have sent us home afraid of one fleet. Now we go home certain of all of them. And the yardmaster, who had read the provision's relevant page that morning because Tio had told him to, that's why, Commander, fear argues with itself on the long ride home. Certainty doesn't, and in the last week before departure, Veth came to Calder one final time, alone by request, and stood with me at the tally in the late afternoon light at the east face, where the carving ends and the blank prepared stone runs on. The assayer's new lens arrays were Earth-made, a gift from the Optics Guild at the spine, better than the old ones, and I believe Veth wore them that day on purpose. I have filed my final assay of the field, Veth said. 200 years of travel, and at the end of it the rotation will read it, and there will be those who say the assay is broken, that the instrument fell in love with the sample. So I have ended it with a finding even a hostile auditor can verify from outside the system, and I would like to know if it is correct before I commit my line's name under it for whatever remains of history. Read it, I said. The assayer read. Finding, the stock of Estate 993 was never the yield of this field. Patience was the yield. They grew it for 500,000 years, and we are the harvest, brought in on schedule, 11 years late, in good order, with a loss of 5. The lenses turned to me, and 4 hands were perfectly still. Is the finding correct, Warden? I looked at the blank stone a while. The sun was going long and red across the flats, and the gun rings under the desert kept their silence. And the ring stood over us, all faint as chalk in the daylight. And somewhere north the new grass was already coming in over the burn scar on the Okafor lease, because the riders had reseeded it before the funerals, that being the order you do things in out here. Add 1 line, I said, and then it's correct. Right. The field bears no grudge against the rain that comes back. It only keeps its own almanac now. I put my hat back on. Your people taught us the schedule, assayer. Tell them we kept it better than they did. Tell them they're welcome at the boundary as guests. Any century they like, and the kettle in Tower 9 will be on. And tell them what stands behind the kettle. The convoy left on the 100th day, the 11 messengers on a hull core of their own ship, refitted, provisioned, escorted to the system's edge by the same 3 squadrons that had shadowed the train in dark for 9 years. Riding visible this time, lights burning, the difference being the message. The cold 800 of the reaping train went with them. Drives reinstated, weapons not. 800 disarmed harvesters carrying home in their empty holds the one cargo the rotation had never once imported. An accurate report. I watched the departure burn from my gallery at dusk, a brief new constellation flaring out beyond the ring, and the wideband carried their last transmission inbound as they went. Veth's voice, in our language, learned over 100 days for this one use. It conforms, the assayer said to the whole listening Earth. It conforms. The veil came back over Calder Flats the same night. Grid square by grid square, the sky closed up its architecture. The ring faded off the sensors of anyone not invited to see it. The gun rings settled deeper into the dirt. The desert put its work coat back on, and by midnight the oldest battlefield on Earth looked, to any instrument that might come, tasting like nothing at all again. Empty range, feral herds, a breathable sky, one weathered tower on the rim of a dry lake with a light at the top, the porch light. We talked in the protocol halls about whether the veil was even necessary now that the truth was riding outward at 2 centuries a telling, and the halls decided what I could have told them they'd decide, because the answer is carved into every warden who ever stood this ground. The truth will travel, and some of the rotation will believe it, and somewhere, someday, somebody won't. I retired the following spring, 50 years to the week from my first watch, and the wardenry being what it is, they let an old gunner choose the manner of his last shift. I chose Tower 9, the night rotation, alone. I made the rounds, I logged the boundary quiet. I stood on the gallery a long time with the kettle going behind me, looking out at the dark range that has never once in my lifetime been what it appears to be, and I thought about Dane and the brothers and a proud dead farmer 500,000 years from home, and the blank stone waiting under the desert with nothing written on it, which is the finest thing my civilization ever built. Then I signed the watch book the way every warden before me signed it, the full form, the old form, and I will end this account the way I ended 50 years of service, because there is nothing truer I know how to write. Range cold, title held. The field remembers, the field is patient, and the light is on for whoever comes.